Our patch this week killed Zabu, gutted Alioth, and reworked Sandman, leaving the metagame scrambling to figure out what the best decks are. Based on the metrics that I've seen over the last few days of things that developed, I don't think we have a clear outlier on what is going to be a longer term best deck, which is exciting. There's room to explore, and there's lots of people playing lots of different things. As always, I got the breakdown for you today. Let's get right to it, shall we? Kicking off by Jeff's picks today, we have a Pixie Lady Deathstrike brew that I have been absolutely loving personally, and that actually has reasonable stats on untaps and a few hundred games logged. Lady Deathstrike was updated in our most recent patch, now a 5/7 that always destroys cards that have 3 power or less with her on reveal. Lets her have utility such as killing opposing copies of Mobius that might be messing up our Pixie, as well as acting as kind of an additional copy of Annihilus to let us clear out copies of the Hood or Century's Void that we otherwise don't want to be leaving in play. The real strength of this deck is the fact that it just plays a reasonable game of Marvel Snap. You've got disruptive elements in Mobius, Spider-Ham, and Iceman. You've got solid numbers thanks to Hood, Sentry, Annihilus, and Red Hulk. And then to top all of that off, Pixie being slotted into this deck gives you some incredible high roll draws that have really high cube equity because your opponent just can't guess what exactly your point output range is going to be. We round out the last couple of slots next with just some generically good cards that provide some utility. Jeff can get into some hard to reach places, and Polaris can be a tricky card to help you line up your opponent's lower power things for Lady Deathstrike to clear out as much as possible when you slam her down on the board. If you want to see this deck in action, be sure to check out my highlight from earlier this week that I'll link in the video description down below. My second Jeff's pick this week is an oldie but a goodie, Stature Darkhawk. As you're going to see as we get through the rest of the decks in this video, there are a lot of combo decks in the format right now, and one of the best ways to disrupt combo in Marvel Snap is simply making them draw their combo pieces less consistently, thanks to the disruption that Korg and Rockslide can provide. This deck list also gets to put reasonable stats into play with its two namesakes, Darkhawk as well as Stature, and we supplement those two numbers with Dakin, who synergizes well with Silver Samurai that not only disrupts our opponent's hand, but also enables Dakin and Stature simultaneously. This deck list also has some key reactive disruptive elements, with Rogue allowing us to disrupt key ongoing effects such as Living Tribunal or Iron Man, and Killmonger, who works double duty to not only kill opposing 1-drops but also clean out Hood or Dakin's Maramasa Shard off our board while doing that. Our high potential category this week features Pixie Patriot. Pixie in particular is, I think, a card that's really been underexplored by the community a little bit. Just an incredibly high cube equity card where your opponent just doesn't know exactly how many points you're going to swing the game by on the end of the turn. Makes it easy for them to talk themselves into staying for big 4 and 8 cube wins where you really get to get ahead. This deck list not only generates big swings like that, but it also has some key disruptive elements in Mobius, breaking up your opponent's cost reduction and mitigating Pixie's downside, in addition to Valkyrie that serves a Shang-Chi-like role of cutting our opponent's things down, while also bringing our smaller things like Mysterio clones or Wasp up to size. Our top performing category this week features 4 different decks that have one common theme between them. They are largely linear decks looking to just generate large numbers in their lanes while typically ignoring what their opponent is doing. The best performing of these so far is a true blast from the past, a Wong-powered Mr. Negative deck. This deck is the high rolliest of high rolls. You'll invert your things that have 0 power, making them completely free. You'll draw them out of your deck with Jane Foster, so you can take a copy of Null and blow it across the board with Arnim Zola, typically after you Shang-Chi a big thing on your opponent's side, so that way you have 2 massive numbers copied across the board. This deck's backup plan also involves Zola, letting you Wong into Black Panther into Zola to put 2 big numbers in big paths again. And then its backup plan involves classic Mr. Negative 05 Iron Man that you can double up with Mystique and then power up further with something like Ironheart that can spread points all across the board thanks to Wong. Our next top performer this week is just classic Destroy. It's a deck list that didn't get touched in the last patch or OTA, so it was a fallback for a lot of people, and it's currently putting up good metrics as people scramble to figure out what exactly is going on in this developing format. Our next top performer this week is an interesting take on Kitty Shuri. This deck list definitely benefited from the recent buff to Angela in last week's Over the Air update. In my mind, the big thing that stands out about this archetype compared to the other linear decks in these top performing lists is that this deck list isn't all in on its combo plan. Because of Angela's return to glory, you could have this pretty reasonable, fair game plan where you just like deploy Jeff, a Nightcrawler, and Vision to her path and then spread them out across the board in a way that's difficult for your opponent to predict. Past that, when this deck is comboing, it's far less susceptible to tech cards than the other deck lists I'm covering here today. Vision allows you to slide your power around the board in a way that's difficult to pin down, and Kitty Pryde jumps back to your hand, making it very easy for you to duck priority, and that's not to mention the copy of Armor that directly counters things like Shang-Chi that are looking to cut down your big cards. One line to note with this deck especially is that if you play Hope Summers on 3, you can Shuri on 4, letting you Red Hulk on 5 into her path, double him up, and then Taskmaster your 6-drop on that last turn of the game. Our last deck list in the top performing category this week is classic Onslaught Living Tribunal combo. This deck list looks to get Iron Man, Onslaught, and Living Tribunal all in one path, so you can make a massive number and then divide it by 3 across the board. It's kind of the opposite of the Shuri list that we just looked at, in that this deck does not have a backup plan. It's leaning on the 7th turn that Magic can generate with Limbo, as well as Jubilee to let us dig deeper in our deck to find our combo pieces every single game. This singular-minded game plan also makes this deck list a lot weaker to disruption than the other decks in this category. Things like Rogue and Enchantress often give you a hard time if you don't find your copy of Cosmo, and because you rely so much on Limbo to get your entire combo together, things like Storm or Snowguard could often disrupt you from that axis as well. That being said, despite all of this, this deck still does have phenomenal numbers because it's very good at making big numbers consistently. As we move into the most popular decks category this week, I think it's worth calling out that none of the 3 deck lists that I'm going to talk about in here broke double-digit percentage play rates in any of the untapped data slices that I looked at while putting deck lists together for this video. They all had somewhere in the 5 to 7-ish% range depending on where I looked, making them decidedly the most popular thing that anybody was doing right now, but definitely not overly popular like we've seen other decks hit, upwards of 20 or 25% play rates in the past, like when Thanos was dominant. The first of these most popular decks is Loki. This deck list, despite being the highest play rate among all 3 of the decks we're going to look at in this category, also has pretty middling performance metrics. I feel like this deck list has a reputation for being a boogeyman that a lot of the more competitive players in Marvel Snap complain about, but its metrics on the public trackers and my own anecdotal experience playing against it really never seem to match its performance to how high its play rate often seems to be. Our next most popular deck is Corvus Glaive Hela. I think it is worth noting that this deck list did have an over 10% play rate in the 24 hours following the patch, but it subsequently dropped down, I would estimate, in large part due to the fact that all of those super linear decks in the top performing category are likely having good performance because they can go over the top of the numbers that a deck like this can put out consistently. I would say the one big thing that this Hela archetype has going for it compared to the other linear decks that go over the top of it, though, is this deck list is really resilient to disruption. Trying to pin down Hela with a copy of Cosmo or Alioth is generally a guessing game at best, unless you can combine it with multiple other cards to force Hela to be played to a particular path. And because this deck list, generally speaking, doesn't have a lot of points into play before Hela flips up on the last turn, it's very difficult to utilize a card like Shang-Chi, for example, to be able to take any points that she's putting onto the board back off of it. Overall, this Hela archetype, I think, is the cornerstone of a kind of rock, paper, scissors we're seeing develop in the format a little bit. The linear decks that we covered in the top performing category that go over the top of Hela are going to rise in popularity a little bit. Then I would wager we'll see decks that are looking to play disruptive tech cards, like Sarah, for example, rise up to punch those down. But then that makes the format ripe for this Hela deck to come back up again and be a deck that's difficult to interact with. I imagine we'll probably see something of this type of cycle play out a little bit until either a new card release or discovery in the metagame puts a new strongest deck on the map that can keep up with all of the above. Our last deck list in the most popular category is this Cannonball Clutter deck. This deck list is also most notably the best performing among decks in this most popular grouping. I would wager in large part due to the fact that Professor X gives you really reasonable gameplay into Hela. You can lock out a lane on turn 4 or 5 with him, so Hela can't put any cards into it, and then your combination of Goblins, Debris, and Annihilus allow you to frequently lock up a second on that 6th and final turn of the game, despite the combo deck flipping big stats out. To wrap things up today, some of you probably noticed that our latest card release, US Agent, wasn't any of the deck lists that I've covered today, so I wanted to call out a couple of quick lists that are somewhat reasonable with this somewhat mediocre card for you weekend mission crusaders. The first of these is this High Evolutionary minus power deck. US Agent provides yet another way for High Evolutionary's Abomination to get discounted. This deck list probably has a pretty terrible Hela matchup, but I think it's probably reasonable into the decks that are packing tech cards looking to rise up against the things in the top performing category that we covered today. Finally, we have a personal favorite of mine, Bast Havoc, that US Agent slots into reasonably. This deck list has a number of proactive disruptive elements, i.e. Goose and Storm, that can kind of force your opponent to play their bigger cards into a specific lane on the last turn of the game, which you can then slam US Agent down into, often getting 6 extra points from his ongoing effect. While I don't think this deck list is going to break any performance metrics, it's reasonably competitive. It's one of my favorite styles to play, and it's definitely what I personally will be doing my weekend missions with for US Agent. As always, thanks for making it all the way through to the end of the video. Be sure to smash that like button if you enjoyed my breakdown today, and if you're new here, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any of the other Marvel Snap content that I put out here several times per week.